This is the story of Max, a bobcat who ruled the household with quiet authority. He kept the two resident dogs, Buddy and Charlie, in line and made it clear he was the boss. But Max hadn't always lived there. He previously roamed the nearby woods before choosing this home, almost as if he sensed it was where he belonged. The family's initial surprise quickly turned into acceptance as they realized Max was comfortable among them and showed no aggression. Max walked in like he owned the place, confidently claiming his spot without hesitation. Despite the dog's resistance, Max quickly established dominance, not through aggression, but with subtle authority. But everything changed with the arrival of Jackson, a clueless yet joyful Labrador puppy. A puppy who sees not a predator, but a new best friend. Stay tuned to witness an unlikely standoff that will tug at your heartstrings and leave you wondering if even the wildest heart can be tamed by the most innocent of spirits. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The world, for the creature that would come to be known as Max, had once been a symphony of deep woods and ancient mountains. He was a bobcat, a ghost of the Blue Ridge, born to the silent language of shadow and scent. His domain was a sprawling tapestry of mist-shrouded hollows, granite outcrops warmed by the afternoon sun, and streams that spoke in a constant, chuckling murmur. For 3 years, this world had been his kingdom, and he had been its silent, undisputed ruler. His life was a rhythm of instinct and necessity. The hunt was a patient dance, a meditation in stillness that ended in a burst of lethal grace. The rustle of a squirrel in the dry autumn leaves, the flicker of a cottontail's tail in the twilight, the scent of a grouse on the wind. These were the notes that composed his existence. He was a master of his craft, lean and powerful, his tufted ears twitching, catching the faintest whispers of the forest, his pale, knowing eyes missing nothing. He knew solitude, not as a burden, but as a state of being. The company he kept was that of the wind sighing through the pines and the distant call of a hunting owl. He had sired a litter once, a brief, fierce flicker of shared purpose with a female as wild and untamed as he. But she and the kits had moved on, following the migratory patterns of the deer, leaving him once more to his solitary reign. But the symphony of his world began to change, subtly at first, then with a jarring dissonance. The low growl of machinery became a daily intrusion, a mechanical beast chewing at the edges of his territory. The sharp, alien scent of diesel and sawdust hung heavy in the air, overpowering the familiar perfume of damp earth and decaying leaves. Towering oaks and hickories that had stood for a century fell with a groan that seemed to shake the very bones of the mountain. His hunting grounds shrank, the familiar paths rerouted by fences of gleaming, cruel wire. The deer grew scarce, pushed further into the high country, and the rabbits and squirrels became wary and skittish. A harsh winter followed a lean summer. The snow fell deep and silent, a beautiful, deadly blanket that made hunting an exercise in futility. Hunger became a cold, hard knot in his belly. He grew thinner, the elegant power in his limbs replaced by a desperate, wiry tension. One frigid night, a skirmish with a pair of coyotes over the meager remains of a road-killed deer left him with a deep gash in his shoulder. It was not a fatal wound, but it festered, a hot, throbbing pain that sapped his strength and clouded his hunter's focus. It was this combination of hunger, displacement, and injury that drove him down from the shrinking wilderness. He began to skirt the edges of a new and frightening world, the world of humans. He moved like a phantom through the manicured backyards and sleeping streets of a small, quiet town nestled in the foothills. The smells were a confusing cacophony: charcoal grills, chlorine from swimming pools, the exhaust of cars, and, most potently, the scent of other tamer animals. From the protective gloom of a rhododendron thicket, he watched one house in particular. It sat at the very edge of the town, where the managed lawns gave way to untamed woods. It was a modest, single-story home, painted a soft sage green, with a wide, welcoming porch and a plume of hickory smoke rising cozily from a stone chimney. An older couple lived there, George and Martha Thompson. He watched them through the wide picture window as they moved with a slow, comfortable rhythm. He also watched their two dogs. One was a golden retriever, old and placid, with a coat the color of spun honey. The other was a younger, more frantic beagle, who seemed to be in a constant state of olfactory investigation. But what drew Max's attention was the sense of safety that emanated from the home. There was warmth there, visible in the golden light that spilled onto the lawn at night. There was food. He could smell it, rich and tantalizing. And there was a strange, ordered peace, a stark contrast to the chaotic struggle his life had become. For weeks, he observed. He learned the couple's routines. George would emerge every morning to fetch the newspaper, his movements slow and slightly stiff. Martha would tend to her bird feeders, her voice a soft, gentle murmur as she chided the squirrels. He saw the way they treated their dogs, with a gentle hand, a soft word, a scratch behind the ears. He saw no cruelty, no threat. The pain in his shoulder worsened. A fever began to burn behind his eyes. He knew, with the stark clarity of a creature facing its own mortality, that he could not survive another week in the wild. The coyotes were getting bolder, their howls closer each night. He was too weak to hunt, too weak to fight. One evening, as a cold, driving rain began to fall, he made his choice. It was not a decision born of courage, but of sheer, desperate necessity. He limped out from the cover of the trees, his fur matted and soaked, and made his way across the wet lawn. He ignored the beagle's sudden, frantic barking and the retriever's low, rumbling growl. He walked, head held as high as he could manage, up the steps of the porch to the glass-paned door. He collapsed onto the doormat, a sodden, shivering heap of wildness seeking sanctuary, and waited for his fate to be decided. Inside, Martha Thompson looked up from her knitting. "George, do you hear that? Charlie's having a fit about something." George lowered his newspaper. "Probably another raccoon at the garbage cans." He stood up, his joints protesting, and walked to the door. He peered through the glass, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Martha," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "you need to see this." There, on their welcome mat, lay a creature of the deep woods, a bobcat, looking less like a predator and more like a lost soul asking for help. Its eyes, luminous even in its exhaustion, met his. And in that moment, a silent, extraordinary contract was forged between the wild and the tame. The arrival of the bobcat on their porch sent a shockwave through the comfortable, predictable world of George and Martha Thompson. George's first instinct, a primal flicker of fear and caution, was to call animal control. A wild animal, a predator, was on their doorstep. It was the sensible, the responsible thing to do. He reached for the phone, but Martha placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Wait, George," she whispered, her face pressed close to the glass. "Look at him. He's hurt." George looked again. He saw past the fearsome reputation of the species and saw the individual creature. The bobcat was unnaturally still, its breathing shallow. One shoulder was matted with dried blood and mud. Its proud, tufted ears drooped with exhaustion. There was no aggression in its posture, only a profound weariness, a surrender. "He came here for a reason," Martha said softly, her voice filled with a conviction that brooked no argument. "He came to us." The two dogs, Buddy the golden retriever and Charlie the beagle, were in a state of controlled chaos. Charlie, a whirlwind of instinct, bounced on his front paws, his barks sharp and piercing, a frantic alarm that a mortal enemy had breached their defenses. Buddy, older and more circumspect, stood behind him, a low, continuous growl vibrating in his chest. His hackles were raised, a ridge of stiff fur along his spine. He was the guardian, and his posture communicated deep, primal distrust. George, swayed by his wife's certainty and the pitiful sight of the animal, made a decision that would alter the course of their quiet lives. He didn't call animal control. Instead, he called their veterinarian, Old Doctor Evans. After a long, hushed conversation, a plan was formed. The process of bringing the Bobcat inside was fraught with tension. George, armed with a thick pair of leather work gloves and a heavy blanket, approached the door. "Easy now, fella," he murmured, his voice a low, calming rumble. The Bobcat watched him, its amber eyes unblinking, but it didn't move. With Martha holding the frantic dogs back in the living room, George slowly opened the door and gently covered the creature with the blanket. He half expected a slash of claws, a hiss of fury. He got nothing. The Bobcat was limp, its energy completely spent. He gathered it up. It was surprisingly light, a bundle of sinew and bone beneath the thick fur. They named him Max. It seemed to fit his regal, if currently dilapidated, bearing. Dr. Evans arrived, a man whose calm demeanor had soothed generations of anxious pets and their owners. He confirmed their suspicions. The Bobcat was suffering from a badly infected wound, malnutrition, and exhaustion. "You're taking a big risk, folks," Dr. Evans said as he cleaned and stitched the wound on their kitchen table, with Max now sedated and sleeping. "He's wild. When he gets his strength back, his instincts might take over." "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Martha replied, stroking Max's soft, spotted fur. "For now, he needs help." For the first few days, Max was confined to the laundry room, a quiet, warm space with a soft bed of old towels. He ate the food they left for him, a mixture of high-quality cat food and boiled chicken, only when they were gone. He was a presence felt but rarely seen, a shadow who drank from his water bowl in the dead of night. For Buddy and Charlie, his presence was an outrage. Their home, their sanctuary, had been invaded by the scent of wildness, of the enemy. Charlie would spend hours sniffing at the crack under the laundry room door, whining and letting out frustrated little yips. Buddy maintained a stoic, resentful distance, refusing to even walk past that end of the hallway. He would lie by the fireplace, his head on his paws, occasionally emitting a low, mournful sigh that was pure canine disapproval. The hierarchy of their small pack had been thrown into turmoil. Buddy was, by age and size, the alpha, but Charlie's nervous energy often dictated the household's mood. Now, a new, unknown variable had been introduced. When Max's shoulder had healed enough for Dr. Evans to give a cautious all clear, the laundry room door was finally left open. The moment was thick with unspoken tension. George and Martha sat on the couch, feigning calm. Charlie immediately began to bark, a defensive, challenging sound. Buddy rose to his feet, a silent, furry mountain of displeasure. Max emerged not with a roar, but with a whisper. He moved with a fluid, deliberate grace that made the dog's movements seem clumsy and coarse. He ignored Charlie's frantic barking completely, as if it were nothing more than the buzzing of an annoying fly. He walked into the center of the living room, his gaze sweeping over the new territory. His eyes, intelligent and assessing, fell upon Buddy. Buddy held his ground, the growl in his chest deepening. This was the moment of confrontation, the challenge for dominance. In the dog world, this would be settled with posturing, snarling, and perhaps a brief, violent scuffle. Max did none of these things. He simply met Buddy's gaze with a look of such profound, unblinking authority that it seemed to drain the energy from the room. It was not a look of aggression, but of absolute certainty. It was the look of a king who had never had to prove his right to rule. He then walked, with an unhurried pace, directly towards Buddy's prized spot, the plush sheepskin rug in front of the fireplace. Buddy's growl intensified, a final desperate protest. Max didn't even glance at him. He simply stepped onto the rug, turned 3 precise circles, and lay down, tucking his paws beneath him. He closed his eyes and let out a soft sigh of contentment, claiming the throne with an act of sublime indifference. Buddy stood frozen for a full minute, a low whine escaping his throat. He looked at George, then at Martha, as if to ask, "Are you seeing this?" But the humans remained silent, defeated not by a show of force, but by an overwhelming display of sheer will. The old golden retriever let his hackles fall. He turned and retreated to a lesser rug by the armchair, a deposed monarch. Charlie's barking faltered, replaced by a confused silence. The new power dynamic had been established without a single tooth bared. Max was the boss. He didn't enforce his rule through violence. His authority was subtle, yet absolute. If Charlie got too boisterous, a slow turn of Max's head, a narrowing of his eyes, was enough to silence him. If Buddy tried to reclaim the fireplace, a single sharp tap of Max's paw on the floor, a sound no louder than a falling acorn, would stop him in his tracks. Max ate first, drank first, and always claimed the best seat in the house. He ruled the household with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a creature who had once ruled a mountain. He had found his new kingdom, and he had no intention of relinquishing the crown. Several months passed, and the household settled into its new, peculiar rhythm. George and Martha had long since abandoned any notion of Max being a temporary guest. He was family now, as much a part of their home as the grandfather clock in the hall or the scent of Martha's baking. He remained a creature of quiet dignity, a wild spirit contained within domestic walls. He never lost his essential wildness. He would spend hours staring out the picture window, his gaze fixed on the distant, blue-hazed mountains of his former life. But he had accepted his new one. He would occasionally allow Martha to stroke his back, a low, rumbling purr vibrating through him, but he was never a lapcat. He was Max, the silent king. Buddy and Charlie had accepted their new stations with a kind of resigned dignity. Buddy, the deposed elder statesman, had found a certain peace in his retirement from leadership. Charlie, ever the opportunist, learned that subservience to the quiet Bobcat often meant a more peaceful existence. The house was calm. It was ordered. It was Max's house. Then Jackson arrived. He arrived on a bright Saturday in early summer, a surprise from George and Martha's daughter, who lived several states away. "You two need some new energy in that house," she'd announced over the phone. The new energy turned out to be a 9-week-old Labrador Retriever puppy, a wriggling, joyous, uncoordinated ball of black fur with paws far too big for his body and a tail that seemed to have a mind of its own. He was pure, unadulterated, clueless joy. His worldview was simple. Everything was a friend, everything was a toy, and every moment was the best moment of his life. He tumbled out of his travel crate and immediately began exploring his new world with the subtlety of a small, furry hurricane. He skidded on the hardwood floors, pounced on dust bunnies, and attempted to chew on the leg of a priceless antique armchair. George and Martha were instantly smitten. Charlie was cautiously intrigued by this new, smaller creature who smelled of milk and innocence. Buddy, ever the grump, let out a world-weary sigh and tried to pretend the puppy didn't exist. And then Jackson saw Max. Max was lying in his customary spot, the sheepskin rug before the hearth, observing the chaos with his usual aloof detachment. To Jackson, this creature was the most fascinating thing he had ever seen. He was not a dog. He was not a human. He was sleek and spotted, with funny, pointy ears and an aura of supreme, regal importance. Jackson's puppy brain, unburdened by concepts like predator, prey, or interspecies etiquette, came to a single, unshakable conclusion. That is my new best friend. With his tail wagging so hard his entire body wiggled, Jackson bounded towards the fireplace. "Arr, rough!" he yipped, a playful, squeaky invitation to fun. Max opened one eye, regarded the approaching ball of black fur with an expression of profound disdain, and then closed it again, a clear dismissal. Jackson was not deterred. He skidded to a halt just before the rug, his front half collapsing into a playbow, his back end wiggling in the air. He nudged a slobbery tennis ball forward with his nose, offering it as a token of friendship. Max did not move. He did not even deign to twitch an ear. The scene set the stage for what would become the central, heart-wrenching drama of the Thompson household. Jackson was in love. He was utterly, hopelessly, devotedly infatuated with the stoic Bobcat. Max, for his part, viewed Jackson as something between a persistent insect and a violation of his peace treaty. Jackson's days now revolved around Max. When Max slept, Jackson would creep as close as he dared, which was usually just off the edge of the hallowed sheepskin rug, and lie down with a happy sigh, content to be near his idol. When Max moved to the water bowl, Jackson would trip over his own paws in his haste to follow, his wagging tail knocking into furniture. He tried every puppy tactic in his arsenal. He brought Max his squeaky toys. He tried to initiate games of chase. He licked Max's face, a gesture that earned him a swift, silent retreat from the Bobcat, who would then spend the next 10 minutes meticulously grooming the slobber off his fur with a look of intense personal offense. Max's response was a masterclass in passive resistance. He never harmed the puppy. He never hissed or growled at him. His method was far more soul-crushing. He simply ignored him. When Jackson approached, Max would get up and walk away. He would leap with silent grace onto the high mantel of the fireplace, a perch far beyond the puppy's reach, and stare down at him with cold indifference. He would sequester himself under George's desk, a dark, quiet cave where the bumbling puppy could not follow. Max had no idea how to escape this relentless tide of affection. He had faced down coyotes, survived blizzards, and stared down a full-grown golden retriever. But he had no defense against this. Aggression would be pointless, like swatting at the rain. There was no malice in the puppy, only a boundless, baffling wellspring of love that Max found utterly, profoundly irritating. The quiet kingdom he had so carefully built for himself now had a court jester, and the king was not amused. The first snow of the season came early that year, a soft, silent dusting that transformed the Virginia landscape into a monochrome wonderland. Inside the Thompson house, however, a different kind of cold had settled. It was the palpable chill of unrequited love, a drama played out daily on the living room floor. Jackson, now a lanky, awkward adolescent of 6 months, had not outgrown his adoration for Max. If anything, it had deepened. His life had a single clear purpose: to win the affection of the aloof Bobcat. Every morning was a new opportunity. He would wake, stretch his long, gangly legs, and his first act would be to locate Max. The search was never difficult. Max would be in one of his usual spots of quiet contemplation, on the fireplace mantel, curled on the back of the sofa, or staring out the picture window at the snow-covered woods. Jackson's approaches were always the same: hopeful, tentative, and ultimately doomed. He would approach with his tail giving a few hopeful, questioning thumps against the floor. He'd lie down a few feet away, his big brown eyes full of pleading. He would let out a soft whine, a question mark of a sound. Today? Will today be the day you see me? The rejection was just as consistent, and its quietness made it all the more brutal. Max would watch the puppy's approach out of the corner of his eye. As Jackson settled, Max would wait a beat, as if to make his intentions perfectly clear. Then he would stand, stretch languidly, and leap or walk away without a backward glance. He would move to another room, another high perch, re-establishing the distance Jackson so desperately wanted to close. It was a heartbreaking ballet to watch. George and Martha felt a pang of sympathy every time it happened. "Oh, the poor little guy," Martha would murmur from her armchair, pausing her knitting to watch Jackson's ears droop and his tail go still. "He just wants to be friends." "Max is a wild animal, dear," George would reply, though his voice lacked conviction. He too felt for the goofy Labrador. "He doesn't understand friendship the way a dog does." But it was becoming clear that Max did understand. He understood the puppy's intent perfectly. He just didn't want it. His rejection was not born of ignorance, but of a deliberate choice. The puppy's boisterous, slobbery, unconditional love was an affront to his dignity, a disruption to the hard-won peace he had found. One afternoon, the heart-wrenching nature of their dynamic came into sharp focus. Jackson, in a moment of unbridled optimism, had found one of Max's few shed whiskers near the fireplace. To a dog, a scent-soaked object was a treasure. He picked it up gently in his soft mouth and trotted over to Max, who was napping in a patch of pale winter sun on the dining room floor. He deposited the whisker carefully in front of the Bobcat, a sacred offering. He then lay down, resting his head on his paws, his entire being radiating hope. Max opened his eyes. He looked at the whisker. He looked at the adoring dog. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he raised a single paw and pushed the whisker away, sending it skittering across the polished wood floor. He stood up, shook himself as if to shed the very idea of the interaction, and walked away to sit by the cold glass of the patio door, his back to the room. Jackson didn't move for a long time. He just lay there, staring at the spot where Max had been. He let out a tiny, almost inaudible whimper, a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak that was far more painful to hear than any bark or howl. He had offered a piece of his hero back to him, and it had been rejected. He finally stood, his movements slow and dejected, and padded over to his own bed in the corner, where he curled into a tight ball. The incident marked a shift. Max's constant rejections began to chip away at Jackson's boundless optimism. He still followed Max, still watched him with adoration, but there was a new sadness in his eyes, a hesitation in his approach. The joyful, clueless puppy was beginning to understand the sting of a closed heart. For Max, life was a constant exercise in evasion. The puppy was a shadow he couldn't shake. He found himself seeking higher and more remote perches, the top of the tall bookshelf in George's study, the upper cabinets in the laundry room. These were places of solitude, but they felt more like fortresses than sanctuaries. He was a king under siege, not by an army, but by a relentless campaign of love he had no idea how to defeat. He had fled the harshness of the wild, only to find himself trapped in a gilded cage with a relentlessly affectionate warden. The irony was not lost on him. He had his safety, his warmth, his food. But the price was the constant, unwavering, and utterly maddening presence of the one creature in the world who loved him most. The turning point, when it came, was not a grand, cinematic moment. It was a series of small, almost imperceptible shifts, like the slow melting of ice under the tentative warmth of the spring sun. The long, cold shoulder Max had presented to Jackson for months began, ever so slightly, to thaw. It began with a shared moment of stillness. A heavy blizzard had descended upon the Blue Ridge, piling snow against the windows and cutting the Thompson house off from the world. The power went out, plunging the house into a dim, fire-lit silence. The usual hum of the refrigerator and the glow of the television were gone, replaced by the crackle of the logs in the fireplace and the howl of the wind outside. The change in atmosphere seemed to affect the animals. The dogs were subdued, sticking close to George and Martha. Max, for his part, seemed to retreat into an ancient, instinctual part of himself. He sat on his sheepskin rug, his body a tense silhouette against the flickering flames, his ears twitching at every gust of wind. Jackson, usually a bundle of energy, was unnerved by the storm. He whimpered softly, pacing the room before finally settling, not in his own bed, but on the floor a few feet from the fireplace, as close to Max as he dared. For hours they stayed like that, two separate beings sharing the same small circle of warmth and light against the vast, stormy darkness outside. Max, who would normally have moved away, remained. Perhaps it was the shared vulnerability in the face of the storm's power, or perhaps he simply didn't have the energy for his usual evasive maneuvers. For the first time, he tolerated Jackson's proximity without complaint. He didn't acknowledge him, but crucially, he didn't leave. For Jackson, it was a victory. A few days later came the second crack in the ice. Martha was in the kitchen, preparing a stew, and had accidentally dropped a piece of raw carrot on the floor. Jackson, ever the opportunist when it came to food, pounced on it, his tail wagging. But instead of gobbling it down, he did something extraordinary. He carried the carrot, wet with slobber, into the living room and dropped it directly in front of Max. He then backed away and sat down, watching expectantly. It was another offering, like the rejected whisker. George and Martha watched, holding their breath. Max stared at the carrot. He sniffed it disdainfully. Carrots were not part of a bobcat's diet. He looked at Jackson, who sat quivering with hopeful anticipation. Then Max did something that made Martha gasp. He lowered his head and gave the carrot a single, delicate lick. He didn't eat it. He didn't even seem to like it, but he acknowledged it. It was a tiny gesture, but it was a concession, a flicker of recognition. Jackson's tail began to sweep the floor in wide, joyful arcs. The offering had, in its own way, been accepted. The true breakthrough, however, came a week later, born from a moment of puppy-induced crisis. Jackson, growing bigger but no less clumsy, had been playing with a tennis ball near a rickety antique coat rack in the hallway. In his exuberance, he misjudged a pounce and crashed into the rack. It swayed precariously and then came down with a clatter, tangling the poor Labrador in a heap of heavy winter coats and scarves. Jackson panicked. Pinned under the weight and confused by the darkness, he began to yelp, his cries a mixture of fear and pain. Buddy and Charlie came running, barking in alarm but unsure what to do. George and Martha rushed from the kitchen, but someone else got there first. Max had been sleeping on the back of the sofa. At the sound of Jackson's real distress, a sound very different from his usual playful yips, his head shot up. His ears swiveled, pinpointing the source of the noise. In a single, fluid motion, he leaped from the couch and bounded into the hallway. He moved not with his usual aloof grace, but with a startling urgency. He didn't hesitate. He surveyed the scene for a split second, then began to act. He didn't try to lift the heavy coats, but instead began deftly, purposefully, pulling at a thick wool scarf that was wrapped tightly around Jackson's neck and front leg. He tugged and pulled with his teeth and paws, not with the playful batting of a cat, but with the focused intent of a creature trying to free a trapped compatriot. By the time George and Martha arrived, Max had managed to loosen the scarf enough for Jackson to wiggle one leg free. George quickly lifted the rest of the coats, and a very sheepish but unharmed Jackson scrambled to his feet. The puppy immediately began to lick everyone in sight, his fear forgotten in a wave of relief. But then he turned to Max. Instead of his usual boisterous affection, his approach was different. It was subdued, respectful. He walked slowly to the bobcat and gave his face a single, gentle lick. And this time, Max did not pull away. He stood perfectly still and allowed it. He even seemed to lean into it, just for a second. Then he turned and walked back to his rug by the fire, the crisis averted, his duty done. But everything had changed. He had heard a cry for help from the annoying puppy, and his deepest instincts, not of a predator, not of a king, but of a protector, had taken over. He had acted, and in doing so, had finally, irrevocably, accepted the goofy Labrador as part of his domain. The siege was over. The fortress walls had come down. The incident with the coat rack was the key that unlocked the final door between them. The heart-wrenching distance that had defined their relationship was gone, replaced by a bond as deep and mysterious as the woods from which Max had come. The king had finally accepted his jester, only to find that the jester was, in fact, his most loyal subject and dearest friend. Max and Jackson were now inseparable. The sight of them together became the new normal in the Thompson household, a constant, heartwarming spectacle. The sheepskin rug by the fire was no longer Max's solitary throne. It was now a shared space, with Jackson's large, lanky body often curled around Max's smaller, sleeker one, a black and spotted yin and yang of fur. What started as Max's reluctant tolerance had blossomed into genuine, visible affection. The change was most evident in their daily routines. In the mornings, Jackson no longer waited for Max to wake. He would nudge the Bobcat gently with his nose, and Max, instead of retreating, would stretch and often greet the dog with a soft chuffing sound, a noise George and Martha had never heard him make before. Grooming, once a source of deep offense for Max, became a ritual of friendship. Jackson would rest his big, heavy head on the floor, and Max would meticulously lick the fur on the dog's scalp and between his floppy ears. It was a gesture of profound trust and intimacy, the wild creature grooming his tame companion, cleaning him with the same care he would give one of his own kits. Their play was a curious and wonderful thing to behold. It was not the rough-and-tumble play of two dogs. It was a game on Max's terms, a subtle dance of chase and pounce. Max would instigate it, batting lightly at Jackson's tail with a soft paw before darting away. Jackson, in turn, seemed to understand that he had to be gentle. He would bound after Max, his movements exaggerated and clumsy, always allowing the smaller, faster Bobcat to escape and lead the chase. They would weave around furniture, their roles of pursuer and pursued reversing in a silent, joyful game that only they understood. Even Buddy and Charlie, the original canine residents, seemed to understand and respect the new alliance. They gave the pair a wide berth, acknowledging the special status of their friendship. The undisputed king of the household now had a prime minister, a goofy, loving, and utterly devoted Labrador who seemed to exist only to be near him. George and Martha found endless joy in watching them. Their quiet retirement had been unexpectedly enriched by this strange, beautiful drama. "Who would have ever believed it?" Martha said one evening, looking up from her book. Max and Jackson were asleep on their rug. Jackson was twitching, his paws paddling in some dream chase, and Max was curled tightly against his belly, a picture of perfect contentment. A wild Bobcat and a goofy Labrador puppy. "That puppy never gave up on him," George mused, lowering his newspaper. "He just kept loving him, even when Max wanted nothing to do with him. Maybe there's a lesson in that." The puppy's relentless, unwavering affection had done what no amount of food or warmth could do. It had pierced the armor of Max's wild heart. It had reminded him of a connection he thought he had lost forever. Jackson's love wasn't a demand. It was a gift, offered freely and without condition, day after day. What Max had first perceived as an annoyance, a disruption to his peace, had slowly revealed itself to be the very thing he was missing. He hadn't known how to escape the puppy's love, and now he had no idea how he had ever lived without it. The irritation that had once furrowed Max's brow was gone, replaced by a look of serene calm. He had found more than just a sanctuary from the harshness of the wild. He had found a companion. The house, once just a shelter, had truly become a home. Years passed. The black fur around Jackson's muzzle began to show distinguished flecks of gray, and his boundless energy mellowed into a steady, gentle presence. Max, too, showed the grace of age, his movements even more deliberate, his gaze carrying the wisdom of a life lived in two different worlds. Their bond did not fade with time. It deepened, settling into a comfortable, unspoken understanding that was the bedrock of the Thompson household. They were a familiar and beloved sight to George and Martha. Jackson, with his ever-present, gentle thumping tail, was the heart of the home, while Max remained its quiet, watchful soul. They still shared the sheepskin rug, their preferred spot in winter, and in the summer, they would lie together in the cool shade of the old oak tree in the backyard. Jackson's head resting on his paws, Max curled in the crook of his legs. The story of the wild bobcat who came in from the cold and the puppy who refused to be ignored became a favorite tale for George to tell his grandchildren when they visited. He would point to the two animals, often sleeping side by side, and speak of patience and the surprising forms that love can take. One crisp autumn afternoon, Martha sat on the porch swing, a warm Afghan over her lap, watching them. Max was perched on the porch railing, a living gargoyle surveying his kingdom of manicured lawn and bird feeders. Jackson was lying on the top step below him, his head tilted up, watching Max with the same look of soft adoration he'd had as a puppy. Nothing had changed, and yet everything was different. The heart-wrenching desperation of those early days was a distant memory, a painful prelude to the beautiful symphony their life had become. What had started as a story of annoyance and escape had transformed into a testament to the power of persistent, unconditional love. Martha smiled. The house was full. Her life was full. She realized that the initial shock of a bobcat on her porch and the chaos of a new puppy had been gifts. They had shaken up the quiet stillness of their lives and filled it with a new kind of drama, a new kind of warmth. In the end, she thought, family isn't about bloodlines or species. It isn't always an instant connection forged in familiarity. Sometimes family is the one who shows up, hurt and lost, on your doorstep. And sometimes it's the one who stays, who loves stubbornly and relentlessly, who refuses to accept your walls, and who, by sheer force of their unwavering heart, turns your entire world upside down in the most wonderful way possible. Max turned his head, his tufted ears catching the sound of her sigh. He looked at her, then down at the ever-watchful Jackson. He blinked slowly, a gesture of deep contentment. He had come to this place seeking refuge from the harshness of the world, and in the most unlikely of companions, he had found his peace. The wild king had been captured, not by a cage or a leash, but by a love so pure and simple it had taught him a new language. The silent, heartwarming language of a true family.